of the meeting or the sales training
No,
today? All right, guys.
no, let's
Um,
just move into it.
yeah, here's the just kind of give you the background on here. The one of the reasons why we wanted to do back to the flip chart presentation is just to rehone our skills, just to make sure that we're doing the right thing every time we go in to make a presentation. Because let's face it, after you've done this 1,000 times, it's easy to get complacent. It's easy to say, I don't need to do the flip chart. I can skip this step. And next thing you know, you're skipping all the steps and you're walking in, you don't use your pre-sale folder and you're just saying, all right, Mr. and Mrs. Client, let me show you what this is going to cost you. And you jump right into it and you do all the shortcuts. It's important with any system, any type of presentation that you're going to do, is that you try to follow the entire system in its entirety. Now, what we're going to be talking about today, Jimmy and I are going to be talking about the flip chart presentation. Obviously, what precedes the flip chart presentation is the sales folder. So before you just hop into the flip chart presentation, and we'll do additional training. We've got some training on the internet about how to just do how to do a proper pre-sale folder, how to make sure that your folder is put together and you're going through that information. So kind of the transition is that once I go through my pre-sale folder, and I go through everything on that, then my transition statement is, Mr. and Mrs. Client, let me go over all the guarantees that these state regulated plans offer. Okay, so that's the transition phase. Then I'm pulling out my flip chart. Now, keep in mind, if you do not have a flip chart, if you haven't ordered one, this is not what they look like. But this is something that I found on the internet that kind of looks like a desktop flip chart. Ours are they look more like spiral notebooks. They're very thin. They're very they're not bulky. You can carry them in your clipboard. They don't take up a lot of room. But this just kind of give you kind of an idea of what when you're going through the flip chart, how we're going to do it. This is the very first page, okay, of the flip chart. Now, it's important not to skip over this first page, okay? Jimmy, I'll let you explain how you do it, but how I do it is that I actually use this front page as a little backstory, to tell a little story. So if you can imagine me sitting there with my client at the kitchen table, or maybe on their sofa, or wherever, on the front porch, doesn't matter. I like sitting right next to either across from them, or if it's a single person, just as an example, if I'm working with just a single male or a single female, I like sitting right next to them, like so we're side by side, and I'll just hold my little flip chart, my little spiral notebook. I just hold it in one hand and I go through. But the first page is an important page because I want to tell my story. I want to tell the story. I said, Mr. and Mrs. Client, it's important for you to know is that I don't work for an insurance company. I work with Senior Solutions. Senior Solutions is a state licensed brokerage. What that means, Mrs. Client, is that I work for you. I don't work for any of these insurance companies. But what I can do for you is that I can help you apply for any of these programs. So if we find a program that fits your needs, I'm going to be able to put you with a top rated company. And I want them to feel good about that. I want them to know that my interest is not with Transamerica or Mutual of Omaha or CFG or whoever. It's not with in any of these companies. And by the way, we've updated the flip chart. We've added a few new companies, and this is, if you order one now, this is what the front page is going to look like. But it doesn't matter if you got one that's 10 years old like mine, or one that's brand new. You just want to tell the story and relate to your clients that you don't work for an insurance company. I think that's important. Jimmy, do you do something relative? I think you do something pretty similar to that opening, correct?
I sure do. I tell them, my job is to find the best solution for you. Everybody's health is different. And so what I'm going to do is, find out what your wants and needs are, and find out a little bit about your health history. And then I'm going to be able to determine which company is going to give you the best coverage and the best rate. And then I say a little joke. I tell them, look, I'm not married to any of these companies, and I cheat on all of them. And they just
I
kind of
like
laugh.
that. That's good, man. That's really good. And it's true. I mean, we don't care which company we go with. We want to go with the company that's going to be the best fit and offer the best value to our clients. So yeah, tell them give them a little bit of back. Use this front page as kind of a backstory to tell them a little bit more about what Senior Solutions and what you're all about. And then the next slide is the expected benefit. Jimmy, do you want to cover this page?
Sure. So what I
Okay.
normally do, is I ask them, are they familiar with all the final expenses, and have they ever had to plan, for somebody's final expense in their family? And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. We just kind of get that personal feedback, and I let them know that, there's more to it than just the direct cost with the funeral home. You got to also think about, most families are going to have some sort of meal after the services, right? Well, that costs money. Where are you going to have that at? How about the cost of moving uh, the furniture and the personal belongings of their loved one? Are you going to have to, how are you going to dispose of that? So like those are some costs that you kind of bring up that people don't think about, and they're very real cost. But then I say, the average cost of a funeral in 2011, it was estimated to be right under $10,000, and this is for a traditional funeral, and this does not include the plot at the cemetery. This is like your services provided by the funeral home. That includes your casket, the cosmetology or the makeup, the embalming, having the viewing of the body and all this stuff. And then I usually try to tie it into a personal story. So, for example, this past year, my uncle passed, and I helped plan that funeral at the funeral home, and it was almost identical. I think it was $9,600 was the cost of his services, and because he was a military veteran, he was able to be buried at the National Cemetery here in San Antonio at Fort Sam Houston, and we didn't have to pay for that. So, I mean, think about it. That's exactly what we're talking about right here. It does not include the cost of the plot. Now, I've priced those out for people before, and they vary. It could be, about maybe $2,600 or even more, depending on location. It's funny. It's just a cemetery plot, but location, location, location. It's still real estate. There's a really nice cemetery that I'd like, and I considered, for myself. And then when I checked into it, they want $20,000 for the plot. So I mean, that's on the high end, right? So I mean, on the low end, you're probably looking as little as maybe $1,500. Those are typically going to be the places out in the country, not really in the metropolitan area, but kind of way out. They're also not well maintained either, right? So it just depends on what you're looking for. But so when you start talking about these costs, like I'm doing, like people start like in a conversational way, then it engages the client, and then they'll put in their experience and what their family members had told them, and then so it becomes a very real thing. And that's all you're really wanting them to do, is to start thinking about what this really costs, and to engage them into the conversation.
Awesome. That was perfect. And hopefully, guys, that um, you can get your clients engaged and hopefully when you're going through the pre-sale folder, you kind of already went through some of this, utilizing the today's funeral cost, today's cremation cost, Social Security future costs, the Mutual of Omaha My Wishes guide. But it's important to have these conversations and do exactly what Jimmy's doing. Is not only is he educating the clients, but he's telling a story at the same time. And people, at the end of the day, everybody can relate to a story. People love storytellers. So learn as you do your in-home presentation and you're doing the flip chart, tell a little bit of a story, create a story. If you don't have a story, use somebody else's story. There's, use Jimmy's stories. You can use my story, but just develop your own story to tell as you're going through the flip chart. It makes it so much more personable and it gets the client involved. The other thing too, Jimmy, is that sometimes I feel agents maybe don't use the flip chart because they're thinking to themselves, well, I don't need to use the flip chart. I know this stuff. Guys, this is not for you, okay? You can have the flip, and hopefully you do. I mean, you should have the flip chart presentation memorized frontwards and backwards. You should be able to do it in your sleep. In fact, you should have dreams about it. I remember I've woken up before in the middle of a presentation, because it's just like I'm always thinking about it, man. I'm always trying to, make sure I'm doing it right. The presentation is for your client. It's not for you. Um, Next page is what is the expected benefit. Jimmy, I'll cover this one. I'm sitting with my clients and this next one says why most people requested the information. I'll say to my clients, Bob and Mary, I've been doing this a long time. Listen, in you can um, you can use the word if you have not been doing this a long time, and trust me, doing something for a long time is subject to I don't know what your expectations or your reality is your own world. Doing this for a long time could be that in 2 more days you've been doing it for a whole week. You know what I mean? One word that you can substitute if you're not comfortable, if you've only been doing it for a little bit, substitute the word I've been doing this for a long time is that I've been doing this for quite a while. So, Mr. and Mrs. Clients, I've been doing this for quite a while. In fact, our company, that card that you filled out, we literally get thousands of people that respond to the same mailer that you responded to. And here's what they tell us. They tell us that they sent in the card for information typically for one of three reasons. And Mr. and Mrs. Client, I just want you to tell me which of these best describes you. One is that they don't have any protection in place right now, and they're worried about leaving a large bill to their family. Second is they have some protection. Maybe they have a small policy they bought a long time ago, or like a traditional life insurance policy, but they feel like they could use a little bit more. And lastly, I meet clients sometimes that have plenty of coverage. They have all the life insurance in the world, but they feel like they still want to leave a small benefit to a special person, like a child, grandchild, or maybe even their favorite charity or church. But Mr. and Mrs. Client, you tell me which of these best applies to you. And you just shut up and let them answer. Because you want them to be able to relate and go back. You want to find out what their answer is. So later, if necessary in your presentation, you can go back and say, well, Mr. and Mrs. Client, when they say, well, let me think about it. I understand, Mr. and Mrs. Client, you should think about this is an important decision. I remember I think you did say that this is important to you because you don't have any coverage in place now. Is that correct? Well, yeah. So it's a tie-in. And what we're doing is our presentation should not only be educational, it should not only be logical, but the presentation has to be emotional too. People buy life insurance not because it's the logical thing to do, it's because it's the emotional thing to do, because at the end of the day, they don't want to leave their family with a financial burden. You think about it, who in their right mind would intentionally know that they're going to pass away, not have any coverage in place just because of poor planning? Nobody does that. So our clients, I know deep inside them, they all have a good heart. It's our job to point them in the right direction. And sometimes we have to dive in on some of those pain points and dive in on how their family would be impacted if they don't have the coverage. Okay. Jimmy, anything you want to add before we move to the next one?
The only thing I want to add to that, Joe, is like you said that the presentation is for the client, which is very true. But I wanted to add is like, why is it important to the client? And other than the words that are coming out of your mouth, it's important because it's a visual aid. A lot of times people are visual, so they need to see something. The other thing too, it establishes credibility with the client. I don't know how many times I've sat down with people in their homes and they say, "Oh, I had this guy come over from this other company, and he didn't have anything. He didn't have a, they didn't say a flip chart, but he didn't have a presentation. He didn't have any business cards, or this was his business card, a homemade one that they printed off the printer and it looked all cheesy, or it was a business card that they scratched out the previous agent's name and they're the new guys, so they hand wrote in the new
Yeah,
name.
I love those.
And then so I'll ask them, well, what did they tell you? Why didn't you do business with them? And it's usually has to do with trust. Well, I wasn't 100% sure if that person was legitimate. I didn't know if they were credible. I didn't know if they were real. I didn't know if they were trying to scam me. They just wanted my bank information. And so I learned from that, and I'm telling you guys that are on the call, because don't let that be you. You could be saying everything right. You could be doing the best presentation, but because you're not giving the visual aid and you're not establishing credibility, they're not buying from you, and you have no reason or no idea of what the real reason is. So make sure you do use the flip chart, establish the credibility, let them know who you are, and then you're just removing that one objection that you may never even know that was the objection. That could have been the reason why you didn't sell anything.
Yeah, that's true, man. That goes back to you may be losing sales just because you're not following the system, and you won't know it. When you skip steps, it's going to cause you to lose business. You won't even know why you're losing business. And then we want to go over the state regulated plans, that the 5 features necessary to secure proper final expenses. Jimmy, would you want to cover this?
Sure.
You do such
So,
an awesome job with this um,
thank
this part.
so guys, don't just read this to the client. They can read, right? You want to tell a story or elaborate on everyone. You want to make it a point to tie in some little story or some elaboration on each bullet point. So this is how I do it. So I usually ask them, are you familiar with how the state regulated programs work? Most of the time they're going to say no. If they do say yes, then I'm going to say great. Then as you know, right? And then I'll go into it, right? So I'll say the first thing is, Mr. Customer,
Hey,
is that
Jimmy, can I ask you a question?
sure.
What I've never had a client say yes. I know how they work. They
I,
always say no.
I have, most of them do, right? But I've had a few like I'm gonna say it's like a pride or ego thing. Oh yeah, I know how that works.
Oh, okay, I got it. Yeah,
But
okay.
you know that they don't, right? So then I'll say, well, as you know, right? Because they said they know how it works. But I'm gonna cover it anyway, right? So I'll tell, the first one here, Joe, is that the affordable premiums, they're guaranteed never to increase And that's regardless of any changes to your age or your health. And then I'll ask them, have you received those cards in the mail, like from AARP or MetLife? And I specifically say that. And I normally am looking for those cards on their dining room table, right? And I'll point it out if I find it. And they usually will say yes, right? And if they do, they normally will grab it, right? That's why I love it when they grab, oh yeah, I have it right here. Well, good. Do you know? And if they don't have it or they haven't received it, then I'll say, well, here's the thing is that most of the time, these insurance companies are mailing you programs and they sound really good up front because the cost is really low, but then it says that they only cover you up to a certain age. In most cases, it's age 79, right? Now, in the pre-sale folder, we already went over the Social Security, expected age. So that, that's something that we didn't talk about today, but that's in your pre-sale folder, right? So we already showed them that their expected life expectancy is going to be probably 81, 83, somewhere in there, somewhere in the 80s, right? So then I'll say, well, what do you think about that, Joe? Like they're only going to cover you up to age 79, but you're expected to live to 83. How does that make you feel? And it usually pisses people off, and they'll have their natural response, right? And then I'll say, now the second guarantee is that this death benefit is guaranteed never to decrease regardless of any changes to your age or your health. And I simply say, and this is very true, I'll say, most of the times where I see this is with government employees that retire. Sometimes their retirement plan starts off with a death benefit really high, and as they age and get older, the death benefit increases. So I've seen that a lot in the state of Texas, right? A lot of, I'm going to say, state employees, when they retire, they have benefits just like that, and it's decreasing. So if they're in that situation, they'll identify. If it doesn't ring a bell to them, then just move on, right? But I'm explaining that. Sometimes I'll tell them, if they told me in the beginning, in the warm-up phase, that they had a really unreasonable amount of coverage at a low price, like it doesn't make sense to you. Like I'll give you an example. I had a client one time tell me he had $100,000 whole life policy, and she was in her 60s, and I think her premium on it was like, I'm gonna say like 30 something dollars a month. Like it didn't compute. And I asked her, well, how long have you had it? And she had only had it for like 5 or 6 years. So I'm like, that doesn't add up, right? So then if I already get that, I'll say it like this: it's guaranteed never to decrease regardless of your age or your health. Sometimes there's insurance companies that they'll put in a base death benefit of, like, let's say $5,000 as an example, and they tell you it's a whole life, which it is, but then they'll add a rider on to give you additional coverage of term, but that does expire, right? And so in this particular case of the lady I was thinking about in Houston, she had a $5,000 whole life policy and a $95,000 term life policy that was going to expire, right? So that's why she was getting it so cheap, because it was a term policy or term rider on a whole life chassis, right? We actually have a carrier that does that. It's Forrester's Financial with the Advantage Plus, right? I don't recommend you to sell it because that's not right. I mean, it's really designed if maybe your client wants $20,000 of coverage to cover their funeral, but they're fairly young. Maybe they have a mortgage. In the next 10 years, they need a little bit additional coverage where you can add on the rider, give them some additional coverage to get them through that phase, right? It's not designed to trick people, but sometimes people write policies like that. So anyway, so I cover that. Then I go on to the third one, is that it's guaranteed to be income tax free to the family. I tell them the death benefit on any life insurance policy is tax free to the family. IRS code says that you don't have to pay a penny in taxes on that. Number four, It's guaranteed never to be canceled due to any changes to your age or your health, unlike other plans. Actually, I think I got that mixed up with number one. Number one is that the rate increases over time. So like going back to the AARP, it shows age bands, and every 5 years the rate increases, and then at age 79 it's terminated. I remember specifically one guy that was kind of cocky with me, Joe. He says, oh yeah, mine goes up every 5 years, but I can afford the increases. That's not a big thing. And I'm saying, okay, great. Well, how are you going to feel when you have your 80th birthday and you kept up with all the rate increases, and now they're going to say you're no longer covered? There's no more renewals. And he goes, well, what do you mean? And then I asked him to get his policy out, and I showed it to him, and he got very angry. Right? So these are the things, these little stories, you have to elaborate on what that means. How does that relate to them? The fifth guarantees that it accumulates cash over time, could be used for emergencies or other financial needs. I tell people simply, look, this is for an absolute emergency, but you don't want to just dip into it because it's there. Every time you borrow money, it reduces your death benefit, right? And a lot of people already know that, but when you're being upfront with them, it just makes them feel more confident in you and know that you're trustworthy because you're explaining that how it works. And then finally, as a bonus, there's no medical exam. So Joe, we're not going to ask you to take a physical. You don't have to give us no blood or urine samples. I'm simply going to sit down with you and ask you some health questions to determine your eligibility. And then I can be able to show you the best plan, and it's going to be at the best affordable price for you. And then I just kind of slide in and transition into the risk assessment.
Perfect. Okay, so this is where, if everything's going smooth from here, you transition directly from here into going into the risk assessment.
Yes, sir.
And then how do you do that? Let's say you've gone through the, you just did what you did. No medical exams required. Now, what's your transition phase to take me, the client, from this page into doing the risk assessment or starting the application?
So I'll just say, so Joe, let me go ahead and ask you a few questions. Are you currently taking any medications that are prescription medications? And then they'll answer. And then if so, I'll get my pen out and I'll start making notes. I make my notes right on the lead, right? So I just write my notes there. I'll ask, how many times a day are they taking it? What's the dosage? All that stuff. Another thing to do is you want to ask them, what do you take this for? Right? So what do you take this for? A lot of times, people may not know the name of the drug, and they'll tell you, well, I take it for this. If you're in their home, you can ask them, do you have a list of your drugs? Or you want to go get your little cooler. Most people keep them in their coolers, right? Sometimes you get lucky and they say, oh, I'm healthy. The only thing I take is high blood pressure. Okay, great. And you just write it down. And then, usually I start with heart. So after I get the medication, I'll ask them, Joe, do you have any history of any heart issues, concerns? Have you had a heart attack? Have you had any, what do you call that, Joe, with the rotor-rooter? Angioplasty?
Stents? Yeah.
I'll ask them, stents, pacemaker, that stuff. I'll ask them, have they ever had a stroke? I usually start thinking about internal organs. So have you had any problems with your kidneys, your liver, your pancreas? If so, do you want to explore those avenues, right? I ask them, have you ever been diagnosed with cancer? If so, when were you last treated? Right? So a lot of people will say something about like, oh, well, yeah, I've been cancer free for 3 years now. Okay, awesome. When was your last treatment? Oh, 6 months ago. Right? So I mean, for underwriting perspective, you want to know when was the date of the last treatment, right? So get that down. I'll ask them about mental health. Have you had any, uh, mental health issues, bipolar, schizophrenia, severe depression, Parkinson's? Have you had any, Alzheimer's, dementia? I'll ask about those things. I'll ask them, if they smoke, do they have any issues with their lungs, right? Do you take oxygen? Do you use a CPAP machine? Ask about those type of categories. When you get all that done, you kind of have a really good idea of what direction you need to go, and then you can use the cheat sheet. Okay. Now, if you're brand new and you're a rookie, then I'm going to change this up for you. Rather than you trying to learn the different categories and different, medical things, is if you're brand new and you're a rookie and you haven't really done this, then go ahead and take out the application for the carrier that you want to use. So for example, if you want to use Mutual of Omaha, then just ask the questions that are on the application and just use that as your guide. Okay. After you do this a while, you'll get to know what the carriers are looking for. So that's why you don't necessarily want to ask that after you've been doing it a while, because maybe they have a condition that's not going to be good for Mutual of Omaha, but it might be good with let's say Royal Neighbors or Liberty Bankers, right? So you kind of want to ask about different medical conditions, get a good idea of what direction you're going to go. Also ask about diabetes is a real big one. How old were they when they were diagnosed? Are they on insulin? If so, how old were they when they first started taking insulin? Any complications associated with it? And then, there's a bunch of additional underwriting questions that you can go through.
Right, Jimmy. And also too, guys, we have a lot of training on our YouTube channel about field underwriting. So that this webinar we're doing is more about getting through the in-home presentation, not field underwriting. But Jimmy's exactly right. Once you've been doing this for a while, you've gone through the application a million times. But I mean, if you're new and this seems overwhelming, like how am I supposed to remember all those questions? Like what Jimmy said, man, just pull out the Mutual of Omaha application. And the first question that you're going to ask them is like, it's usually the first or second question on any application. Say, Mr. and Mrs. Client, I know this is going to seem silly, but I'm required to ask you, are you currently hospitalized or in a nursing home? And they're going to laugh and say no. And then you just word for word read every single question on that Mutual of Omaha application. And like what Jimmy was doing, when you get to a certain thing which says, well, yeah, I was diagnosed with diabetes before age 50. Okay, great, no problem. Don't skip over it. Learn to ask the questions, dive in and ask about, well, how old were you when you actually got diagnosed? What type of medication do you use? How is it being treated? Is it under control? Do you have any complications? You'll learn all these things. And we're here to help you every step of the way. Jimmy, before I forget, one other little sales point I want to make is that when you're going back through the guarantees on number 5, where it says guaranteed cash value that accumulates over time that can be used for emergencies or other financial needs. And then Jimmy went in and went ahead and explained is that, listen, we don't recommend that the client borrows money because it takes away from the death benefit. Well, not only does it subtract from the death benefit, but if they never pay it back, there's accumulated interest that accumulates. It's somewhere, depending on the carrier, could be as low as 5%, it could be as high as 10%. Okay. So one thing is that when you're one sales tip, this is something I learned a long time ago, is that when you find a client that has coverage, and let's say you have a client that's 75 years old and they got a policy for $10,000 and you're reviewing it and the policy looks good. Okay. Premiums are good. It's a good company. Maybe it's Mutual of Omaha, whoever. You always want to ask your clients, oh, out of curiosity, have you ever borrowed from this policy? Because I had a client once that borrowed from their policy and it wasn't a lot of money. It was like a $10,000 policy. And I don't know, man, they borrowed like $1,000 or $1,500. And it was like 15 years ago. And that interest had accumulated and it subtracted from their face amount. I ended up calling. I said, Mr. and Mrs. Client, did you ever pay that money back? No, we never paid it back. I think it just reduced from the face amount. I said, it does, but there's interest. We better call. We called the company, and their $10,000 death benefit was like cut in half because of interest. They really only had like a $5,000 policy. So those are the one things that, as you're, and you'll get this knowledge as you gain experience. But that's an important thing, is that when you're reviewing a policy and you see they have a $10,000 policy and they've had it for 15 years, make sure you always ask the question, if have they ever borrowed money from it. And then the what kind of like my transition phase, Jimmy, is that when I get through this and I said, and best of all, Mr. and Mrs. Client, there's no medical exams. I said, but that's why I'm here. Because remember, I told you I'm a state licensed field underwriter. So it's my job just to ask you some quick health questions so I can determine which of our top rated carriers is going to ask you the best value. And then I just simply transition into the asking the health questions, just like Jimmy did. Now we do have another page to the flip chart. So if you're feeling good and you're confident, you can stop here. Like if you see like your clients nodding their heads and they're like totally into it, and they're like, you just feel that you're ready to transition into asking the medical questions, and then from there you're going to move into the 3-option close. There is another panel, or another page to the flip chart. I would probably, Jimmy, what do you think? If you're new, when let me ask you this question, Jimmy. When do you not use this page? Like,
The only time I don't use it is like you just described, like you know everything's going well and they're moving forward, then I'm just gonna skip over it. I can always come back to it if needed.
right.
But if I don't know, let's say I don't get that vibe that they're gonna move forward just yet, or sometimes people, they're hard to read, then I will cover this. And I think it's important to say that a lot of times when people are looking to take care of their final arrangements, they're also considering doing a prepaid funeral with the local funeral home, right? And that's what this page is designed to do, is to cover that objection. So it might be the reason why you're not getting the vibe that they want to move forward with life insurance is because in that couple's mind, after you leave, they're also going to go to the funeral home to find out what that cost, right? So that's in the back of their mind. So you want to cover this also. So, I just slide into it and I'll say, look, these are the, three, I guess, options that you have for final expense planning. The first one is to do nothing. And this is not really a good option. I think you'd agree. That's why you mailed in the card, because if you do nothing, then you're basically passing that financial burden onto the family. And you don't want that to happen. And they usually say, oh, no, right? So they agree with you. Option number 2 is you can go to the local funeral home, right? And I usually will name them, right? So like over here, I'll say, oh, you can go to Castillo's funeral home and you can meet with the funeral director, and they're going to give you all the options. They'll show you all the flowers, the caskets, they'll give you all the options for your funeral. And then they're going to put a price tag on it. Let's just say they come back and it's going to be $10,000, right? And they'll say, okay, Joe, well, we can go ahead and put a payment plan together for you. And it's a lot like layaway, right? So they're going to want you to pay it off normally within 5 years, right? But there's a couple of problems with this, Joe. The first problem is that it's not life insurance. So if you were to pass away before the balance was paid off, then that balance passes on to your family. The other thing is, because they know it's not life insurance, guess what they do? They go ahead and add life insurance into the plan. So you're going to end up getting life insurance anyway. The only real difference here, Joe, is that the funeral home is the beneficiary, not your children. So let's take a look at that. Let's do the 10,000 and let's divide it by 5 years. And how much is that going to cost you, right? And then if they want like a fancy, like a fancy funeral, they're talking about all the stuff that they want, then you can say, hey, well, that's probably going to be more like 15,000, but you take the 10,000 and you divide that by 5 years, that turns out to be $166 a month. And so when you quote that to people, most of the time, that's out of their budget. They're like, oh, and then you got to say, now you got to remember that you still have to add the plot, and you still have to add the cost of the insurance that they're going to add to this. So your payment is probably going to be closer to $200 a month. Now, does that fit comfortably with your budget? Most people are going to say no. So what did I do there? I just took the funeral home right out, right? That objection of them wanting to go check it out, they're not going to want to do that no more. Okay. The third option is you can, we feel this is the best option. You can get a final expense plan. See, that's a whole life insurance policy that there's no expiration date. If you live to 120, you're always going to be covered. And when you pass, that death benefit is going to go directly to your beneficiary, and then they can use that to go to any funeral home and pay for your cost. And what's more important, Joe, is that whatever money's left over, they get to keep to use that for other expenses. And that's basically it. So, Joe, which one of those three makes the most sense to you?
The number 3, the final expense plan.
There you go.
All right, man. Well, guys, that is it. We will go ahead. Thanks, Jimmy. That was amazing. So we'll get this. We're recording this. We'll get it up on our YouTube channel. I'll get it emailed out to everybody. But man, in a nutshell, this is it. And it's just so important not to skip or bypass, or don't try to shortcut this. This is, one of the probably the most important part of your income presentation is doing the flip chart. There is one other page that you don't need to use, but it is back here if you wanted to explain this, the application process, and you could, basically how you would do it. Here, let me go back. The client says, well, yeah, I want to apply for a final expense plan. Well, great. Let me just explain to you the process. I'm just going to answer a few simple health questions, and I'm going to find a program that's going to offer you the maximum discounts, and we'll find the program that meets your needs and, more importantly, your budget. And then I'll just fill out a request for coverage, and I'll send that in to the company. And some companies require a phone interview. If they do, we'll go ahead and do that. Submit the application to the insurance carrier. We get a decision back within 5 to 10 business days. You're either going to be approved, declined, or a counteroffer. And then if you, for some reason, if it doesn't get approved, then we'll go with a different company that's going to offer you a great benefit. And number 8 is that you receive your policy by mail and you simply accept the coverage. So that's kind of the application process. I don't use that page, but it's there. If you're new, and if you feel like you need it to kind of explain to your clients, what the next step is. So with that, everybody have a great weekend. Remember, if you are interested in attending the Orlando event, or if you have a friend or somebody that you know that you want to refer over to Orlando for me to meet with, get in touch with me. All right, Jimmy, I'll talk to you later, buddy. Thanks for doing an awesome job.
Thank you, Joe.
All right, man. Everybody have a great weekend. Take care.